you very much. Thank you for all coming tonight. I appreciate that you all have great concerns, and we've assembled the right people tonight to find the right solutions for our schools and our community. Before we jump into the numbers, I would like to just go over some basic housekeeping rules. The meeting will maintain decorum, please. Unruly or disruptive guests or presenters, myself included, will be asked to leave the meeting. Should unacceptable behavior continue, I may be prompted to call for an adjournment, and that does nobody any good, so I don't want to have to do that. We will follow what is called the SHARP Code of Conduct for those of you from Green Hill School, which I am near and dear in my heart to. That means safe, honest, all respectful, responsible, and productive behavior. If this is a standard that we hold our school children up to, we all can follow this as well easily. Some of you may question tonight why this venue of this size and why there's no public participation. When we held the first workshop to discuss the budget back on April 4th, we adjourned knowing our work wasn't done. This workshop we rescheduled for tonight. The agenda went out on April 8th as a special meeting, and it did not include public participation. The goal of tonight is to roll up our sleeves and work, and that work still remains. Quite honestly, it's rare that we have any public attend the Board of Finance meetings and workshops. For some reason, credits and debits and numbers don't hold the same fascination for most of you as it does for us. We did not, at that time, envision the twist of events and announcements that have since occurred. So my apologies that this venue is smaller, and that because of the need that we need to spend this time working, we're going to allow other opportunities in the future for public participation. I recognize that many of you do want to share your current concerns and voice. But selfishly, I need to protect tonight to work. You're going to hear a lot of details tonight, so you will leave here informed. You will have answers. You will be provided information about the general budget as a whole. You will hear from Board of Finance members. You will hear from the Controller's Office. You will hear from the Board of Education. So you will leave with information, and that alone has power. The opportunities to give public participation will include next Tuesday at 6:30 p.m., which is the regularly scheduled Board of Finance meeting. Another opportunity will be on May 10th at 7 p.m., which is the City Council meeting. Again, public participation. And on Wednesday, May 4th, at what time are the Board of Ed meetings? 7 p.m. They also have public participation. Of course, many of you already have the email addresses of the Board of Finance, the City Council, and I'm sure you could find the members of the Board of Education on the city website that you feel free to email as well and share your concerns. So that's how I'd like to proceed, and just to give you an idea how I envision tonight to go is that we're going to ask the Controller's Office to give us kind of an overview of where we are right now. What numbers came in from all city departments, including Board of Ed, and the impact to the mill rate. Some things that have occurred both from the state of Connecticut that impact our budget, things that we made decisions locally that have all impacted the mill rate. And then we'll show you where things stand today. As I mentioned, this is a work in progress. We know we didn't get to where we wanted to be on April 4th. And this is a continuation of that work. So I hope that you'll be pleased, or at least leave informed with what we discussed tonight, but no votes will be taken. Our work might not finish tonight, but I pledge to you we will continue the work until we have a budget that can be approved by the entire joint board. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to the Controller's Office for a brief overview. John? Huh? Yes, we can do that. I'm neglectful. I wanted to salute the flag. I always start our meetings with that. I'm just so nervous tonight. So please just understand that, okay? So if you join me in the pledge, please.
Of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Glenn, just one thing. Would it be possible for you to post this on our website?
Oh, most actually, yes.
Okay, so those of you who can't strain to see the numbers, Glenn will post the slides on the city website under Board of Finance so that you can look at them at your leisure.
Thank you, Cheryl. Just introduce myself. My name is Glenn Klockow. I'm your city comptroller. Sitting to my left is Jody McGrain. She's the administrative assistant in the controller's office. And to my immediate right is Robin Manuel. She's the assistant comptroller. And to her immediate right is Skip Gillis. He's our senior accountant. This is generally the budget staff on the city side. You may recall this presentation is a shortened version of what took place when I made the presentation last time. There was probably 30 slides. There's probably 1/3 of that. But the point of this presentation here is to give you, as Cheryl pointed out, a recap of where we are. A couple things have changed at the state legislature, so we've incorporated that in here. And there were some consensus decisions made. So with that, we'll start the presentation. First of all, just to give you an overview, if you recall that the variance, including the city and the Board of Ed at the request level, was $8.5 million, and the total variance would increase the mill rate by 2.5 mills. A mill is worth $3.4 million, you may recall. We break out the request by general city, which is all city departments, excluding education. And then, as you can see, the education request coming in. You can see the amount for general city, $5.2 million, and the education amount of $4.7 million. Total general fund increase of $9.9, almost $10 million at the request level. The members here and the audience may not know, but it's that the Controller's Office, generally speaking, makes suggestions and recommendations to the Board of Finance. Our office has no authority of the vote. There are only suggestions and recommendations, and they're a starting point of conversation. So just make that clear that our office, when we make these suggestions, because there's no authority of voting power, just to give a recommendation and a start. On the general city, you can see the increased amount was $3.4, almost $3.5 million. And very briefly, what we do as this budget team here is we meet with all the department heads in my office, go through their requests, get a feeling and an understanding for those requests. And the reason we do that is because, in addition to the departments, we're the office that implements and monitors the budget for auditing purposes and financial statement purposes at year end. So that's something we do on this side. We understand also the education offices do the same thing. Superintendent and their finance committee meet with all the offices. Our recommendation was 3.5 on the city. Our recommendation was 1.540, $1,500,000 on the education side. Part of the reasoning for those two numbers was there was a request to try to keep the mill rate. See, our focus is also mill rate. We try to keep the mill rate increase under 1 mill. And so basically this, as you'll see, it comes under a mill, and we'll see in a future slide.
Glenn, could I just interject for
Sure.
a moment? Prior to this point of rolling up the budgets, each of the individual departments present to the Board of Finance. Many of our council members have sat in on their presentation where they go over their budgets from police to fire to corporate counsel. So we have very robust discussions with each of them, asking significant questions, which helps Glenn to form some of those restatements. The public is always invited to those, and if you're curious what's included in those items, they can be found on the city website. If you inquire under budgets and go to 2016 through 17, you can see the nuts and bolts of what started those requests. Glenn, thank you for letting me interrupt.
Oh, no problem. So everyone here, if you recall, our current mill rate is 34.61. In simplistic terms, if you have a home valued at $100,000, your tax on that home at the current mill rate would be $3,461. That's a simplistic way of looking at it. And then we started out this presentation with the city and the Board of Ed at the request level, an increase of 2.5 mills. So it would have went up to 37.11. Now, you recall, Board of Finance, we had about 30 slides where we showed the reductions in all the different departments that we recommended. On the city side, those reductions, operating and capital, came to 0.51 reduction of that 2.5. On the Board of Ed side, bringing their amount from $4.7 million to the $1.54 million, reduced that 2.5 mill rate by 0.95. The budget has two sides, as everybody knows. On the revenue side, we met with departments and increased a couple numbers, primarily in the tax office for prior interest and liens and things of that nature. So you can see the revenue increases reduced that 2.50, increased further by 0.09. Total adjustments that we recommended to the Board of Finance was 1.55. The net increase was 0.95. There's no direct relation between this having to come out with the Board of Ed at 0.95 and the net increase. There's no correlation, direct correlation. So the last time we met and the Board of Finance met, that's where we ended with a 0.95 increase. Things have changed since that time. The changes are here, maybe a little bit unclear to see, but you can probably see it better in your handout. A lot of this came from the state of Connecticut. The preschool was reduced, as you can see, and there's the mill rate impact. A large number, you may recall that we were told that we would get $1.8 million in sales tax revenue sharing, and at that workshop meeting we decided with a consensus that we probably should hedge our bets and only put half of it in at $900,000, because there's a history of the state of Connecticut saying we'll give you X and then at the end they take it away. So what we did is we only put in $900,000, and last week the governor's office cut that further by $617,000, giving us a net of $300,000. So we, in an odd way, we kind of won our hedge bet, because if we put the $1.8 million, we would have to cut, 1.5. So we only had to cut 6. Thank the Lord. The Guy Moran's building office, I understand the ordinance passed for increasing the permit fees. And speaking with Guy, he feels confident that we can increase the fees by $400,000. As you'll notice, that's pending council approval. It wasn't approved in the last meeting. I anticipate it to be approved in upcoming meetings, but we have time. But it's pretty a solid number. Then at the last meeting, you may recall also that there was a decision to restore Public Works, roads, and fleets. There were two separate numbers. We combined them here, $75,000 and $200,000. You can see the impact increased the mill rate. So we went from the top where it says mill rate impact of 0.95 when we left the last workshop, and the reductions at this point and increases brought it to 1.08. So that's where the mill rate lies at this point in time.
Glenn, may I interject again?
Of course.
Sorry. Just one thing is, if you see the reduction in the Bristol preschool, this was a request for a donation. So it wasn't impacting somebody's operating budget. It was a request for a donation that we brought back down. And secondly, just on the permit fees, Guy Moran also says this will bring us in line with our surrounding communities, which we currently are significantly below in those fees.
Good point.
Thank you.
And the preschool, you get $5,000, I believe, right?
Yes.
Yeah, so it wasn't completely eliminated. The request was $50,000, and we left in $5,000, similar to other organizations that have requested money funding, like St. Vincent de Paul and other organizations like that. Next slide, Jody. There's been some discussion about, and you've probably seen in maybe emails you received in the public and at the board, about Board of Education funding in the past. And I'd like to just have Skip spend a little time to talk about, it's a little fuzzy to see up here, but he'll be able to explain it, the numbers a little clearer. Briefly, Skip, can you just go over some of the funding that we've received that is a little bit in conflict with zero funding for Board of Education?
Yes, Glenn. Thank you. Thank you. don't know about you guys, but it's more than just a little fuzzy. I can't see it from here, so it's a bit of a gamble. I actually have probably the easiest job tonight, and maybe the most difficult. But what my job tonight is to basically show that the Board of Education has been funded every year. And I'm going to show you how that funding happened. Now, it gets a little, well, it's a little fuzzy, but it gets a little bit more complex than it probably should be. But that's the world that we live in. Now, I'm not going to basically go through every single line item that's on this slide, but I am going to go through enough of the activities so that everybody has an understanding of the types of components that we're talking about. So let me go right to the section that says funding, and the very first item that's on there. Well, actually, let me back up a second. If you look at the slide, and if you could actually...
Now, they'll be able to see it if they go online.
If you look at the 2016 and 17 year, you're going to see an item in there that says unknown. And what Cheryl mentioned earlier is what I'm also going to say, and that is basically that the 2017 budget year has been and still is ongoing as it relates to that particular number. All right, now let me back up a second and go back to funding. The very first line on that, under that funding, is called mill rate. And the amounts that are in those columns for each of those years is basically the amount of funding to the Board of Education that was borne by the residents of the city in terms of tax increases. That is mill rate. That's tax increases. Okay? The second item that I want to talk about, I'm going to stay in the 2013-14 year. The second item I want to talk about is that in 2012, there was a surplus, that the Board of Education had a budget surplus. And it got approval to use that budget surplus to prepay its health benefits in the next year. In other words, in year 2012, yes, hold the money, prepay next year, reduce next year's budget. That means it funded this particular year, 2013 and 14. The next item is actually quite easy to deal with. What the city did is it provided funding from its equipment sinking fund, $415,925 to buy, for the Board of Education to buy smart boards. The next item is another $384,000 and change to buy, or to pay for, or assist in paying for, a wireless infrastructure at the Board of Education. Now, what I want to say next is, yes, that was added to the budget, and yes, they spent all of the money, okay, as they should have. Now, if you go into the next year, I want to only address a couple of things, and one of them gets a little bit tricky. And that relates to the $110,000 that's sitting under the year 2014-15. And off to the immediate right is another $916,000. If you add the two together, you're going to get $1,026,859. By statute, if the Board of Education has a surplus, they are allowed to keep 1% of the budget for that year. So if you go over to the budget that's being displayed for 2012 and 13, and you take 1% of that, you get $1,026,590. And the Board of Education carried that into first 2014 and used the 110, carried it into 2015-16 and used the remainder of it. Okay, it's simply added to their budget. The city began a program in 14-15 to basically say, we will provide the Board of Education $100,000 a year from our sinking fund for equipment. What that means is that the Board of Education, the first $100,000 is purchased in operating equipment from their operating budget is paid for with this $100,000. It's as if someone added $100,000 to your budget, which of course we did. Now, after that, there's a number of items that we did because we had certain advantages in one year about where we had a significant savings in health care, and we passed that on. And as Glenn pointed out earlier, one of the things that we, not just us, all of us, try to do is provide the absolute best we can for the city of Bristol with the minimum amount of mill rate, the minimum amount of increased taxes, okay? You could call it creative accounting. You can call it, well, that's the way it is in municipalities. But we've been able to do it, and it's been done, and this is the slide that shows everybody that here's the funding. Yes, it gets a little convoluted, but it is real. It adds up to the numbers that we are displaying, and it happened every single year.
All set.
Through Chair.
Yes.
Through Chair. So, Skip, just to make it clear, what you're saying is the Board of Ed has not been flat funded.
Oh, no, the Board of Ed has not been flat funded.
Thank you.
Thank you. You're going to introduce Roger?
Yes, as I previously mentioned. Excuse me?
You're doing your capital next?
Dr. You were going to do the...
Oh, okay. Sure.
Robin Manuel, our Assistant Comptroller. And, you know, in addition to the operating budget, folks, there's a capital budget, and that is basically approved as a subcommittee of the Mayor's office with members of the Council and the Board of Finance, and it approves capital projects that are very large in nature. Okay, but what's very unique, at least in Connecticut, is that when the projects are approved for education, the city side pays for those projects. The charge card, the bonding, the principal and interest is paid and borne by the city side. So we just want to point out that we're not negligent in our duties. And Robin, maybe you can just expound and show some of the things that have taken place.
Sure, thank you, Glenn. So on the slide before you, if you can read it, it shows fiscal year 2013-14 through the budget year that we're working on now, 2016-17. And this shows the capital project commitment the city has with the Board of Education. These projects are all paid either through bonding, which the city pays the full cost for through mill rate, cost of issuance, and also paying the principal and interest payments, or cash has paid for all of these. So these projects were specifically paid for by the city, not the Board of Education. And this was in addition to their operating budget that they received these projects.
Yeah.
The next slide shows the 1998-99 fiscal year through 2012-13, and two of the more notable projects you'll probably see on this list are the two K through 8 schools. Those projects were in the $50 million range, although they came in a little bit lower, the $45 million range. And the column all the way to the right shows the amount that the city had to bond. The other amount was paid with state grants. But a total of $59 million has been paid for by the city for Board of Education projects.
Great.
And on the next slide, today we received information from our health benefits consultant, some really great news. We had originally planned for a 9.9% increase in our health care budget. The Board of Ed included that percentage increase in their budget, and the city did as well on our side. The budget is now coming in at about 6% increase. So the savings that is attributable to the city's side of the budget is $464,000, which is about a 0.14 mill rate factor. And the Board of Education has a savings of about $578,000. Now you remember in the beginning, the gap right now for the Board of Education between what was presented of $1.54 million, the gap that's still left is $3.2 million. If you reduce it by the $578,000 in the health care savings, we're now at $2.6 million.
Okay. Thank you.
That's it.
For all that input. And they've been working hard at this throughout the day, so I want to really thank their efforts. Just so you're aware, some of the capital items that are in the future for the budget, there are significant capital dollars that are coming up. that involve items at Edgewood, Chippens, Northeast, some of these to the tune of, $25 million as they retrofit and outfit schools, and those are in future years. So these are things on the horizon. I think what we've tried to demonstrate, and I just wanted to share and remind, first of all, the Board of Finance where we were on the operating side, but also demonstrate that significant funds outside the operating budget are provided to all departments, but also to the Board of Ed in these major capital improvements. And they all come out through the mill rate in the form of debt service, principal, and interest. And so they roll up as well. I was also, one other thing I was neglectful, I did not have the Board of Finance members introduce themselves. So before I turn the meeting over to the Board of Ed, give them a minute to get ready, I'm going to ask the Board of Finance, and actually we have 3 town councilors sitting on the desk, so they can all introduce themselves. No, you guys don't want to, so starting with Mike.
Mike Lamoth. Orlando Kelfi. Mike Ferrini.
Ron Burns. John Smith.
Mayor Ken Cocaine.
Derek Angelesky.
Jade Carrier.
And I'm Cheryl Tebow. So one thing the mayor just whispered to me quickly, and I just want to interject it real quick here. I don't want to spend a lot of time on it, but we've also seen a lot of questions about the synthetic fields. And I just wanted to take a minute to talk about that. The synthetic fields came before the Board of Finance about a decade ago. Now, I want to say it's been a good 2 to 3 year study in which we were approached that there were not enough playing surfaces for the youth and the adults in athletic programs in our community. Field committees were formed. They look at several alternatives where they could build new space, where they could increase size. One of the things that they talked about was the use of synthetic fields, which would produce more playable hours. After several scenarios and several options, they proposed putting them at the schools. As far as parity goes, you can't do one at Bristol Eastern and not at Bristol Central. We're not going to get into Lancers versus Rams. That's not going to happen. So the decision was, if we're going to do this, we're going to be fair. It would be a significant cost. So the field committee was challenged with a few things. First of all, to prove a significant increase in playtime that was available to the general public to make this investment worthwhile to the taxpayers. And they were successful in doing this. As a result, this did go before both the Board of Finance and the City Council. It is not operating cost. If we were to cut the fields out of the budget today, it comes out of this capital report that you just saw. So it's not available to take out of capital. We're going to amortize that over 20 years, just like you would your mortgage. So it's not, you would only have a piece that you could take and put to operating funds. So it's not a apples to orange comparison. So I just wanted to put that out there. And just on a note, we have collectively at this table decided there will be no crumb rubber in those fields. And we are going to be looking at alternative fields because we felt that was important for our youth. So without further ado, I would like to invite the Board of Education to come up. And one of the things that we asked them at the April 4th meeting to help us understand is what kind of impact some of these decreases in the requested budget would have. And so we're going to ask them to present how they arrived at this decision, how they calculated it, and then we'll open up for questions from the board. So I will turn it over to you. Thank you.
Good evening. First and foremost, I would like to take this opportunity on behalf of the Board of Education to thank the members of the Board of Finance, the City Council, and the Mayor for hosting this workshop this evening and for giving us the opportunity to have a voice in what is a very complex and challenging picture going forward. I would also like to thank all of the staff members and the parents and community members who turned out tonight. Because if there's no other testament to the fact that Bristol cares about its schools and its children, it sits with all of us tonight, and what a wonderful testament it is. Further, it's a testament to the recognition that this is a community effort. And if there was anything to be had with this morning's very productive meeting between members of the Board of Finance and members of the Board of Education, it was just that this complex process called budget and finance is in fact a community endeavor. And we are making every effort to join together, to have productive dialogue going forward, to recognize that there is give and take, to understand that nobody is able to have everything that they ask for. It's a limited pot, and we will do everything we can from the Board of Education's side to be fair, to be diplomatic, and to work together with the Board of Finance going forward to make the decisions that are best for everyone. So, again, on behalf of the Board, I thank the Mayor. Cheryl, I thank you, and members of the Board of Finance for what was a very productive dialogue this morning. We look forward to further conversations about possibilities in funding for Board of Education. I'd also like to highlight that the Mayor did send me an email yesterday inviting all of us as members of the Board of Education to a dialogue on or before April 28th, again, to pursue some creative ways that we can possibly join together to provide innovative cost savings and to take some of the pressure off of the future operating budgets. So I anticipate with great excitement that that dialogue will take place. I believe we also have some concepts that we, again, can pursue with further conversation to help work together to alleviate some of the stresses that we're all experiencing on this budget. So with that, I think I will outline in general terms what's happened chronologically over the last week, week and a half, and then I will turn it over to my colleague Gary Franzi, who can speak more specifically to numbers around what's been outlined. As Chairman Tebow mentioned, we met with all of the members of the Board of Finance on April 4th, and as Comptroller Mr. Klockow outlined, there was a recommendation going forward that the funding for the Board of Education begin at 4.47, and preliminary recommendation was to be reduced to 1.4. The board was then asked to come back to the Board of Finance with a scenario or scenarios, in other words, impact statements around what that reduction could look like. The board met subsequent to that on April 6th to discuss scenarios around that. And I stress the word scenarios because scenarios are not permanent solutions. The board has taken no action around the scenarios that were proposed. It was simply an effort to take a first look at what possibly would transpire with a reduction to that degree. There were discussions around those scenarios of closing a school or schools as a part of the process. The reason for those discussions is if a reduction of multi-million dollars were to take place, it definitely would impact staffing across the district. And again, that preliminary set of scenarios was discussed. It certainly doesn't limit us to coming back to you with other scenarios or scenarios that are based on perhaps different numbers that may or may not be recommended going forward. So as a result of that discussion, you have tonight staff and community members who are clearly concerned about the outcome of this budget, as are we. And it's a double-edged sword because we are very grateful for the support, and yet all of us are struggling with what is a very difficult dilemma going forward. And I want to stress that whatever decisions are made on the Board of Education side will be done with sensitivity, with compassion, with recognition that we are a people, first and foremost, a people business. And so whatever reductions are made as a result of this budget and the struggles that we have going forward will be done the right way and not as a knee-jerk reaction. Finally, we did hold a meeting this morning, as I referenced earlier, between members of the Board of Finance and members of the Board of Education. We discussed in depth the dramatic impact that exploding special education population and resulting costs have had both on this year's budget for the Board of Ed and potentially on next year's budget. And we talked about implications for that as well as possible solutions going forward. One of the solutions, or at least one of the positives that came out of that meeting, among many, was a discussion around an upcoming special education audit. We have hired a company or an organization known as CREC, which is our regional education center. They will be coming in to work with us directly to strategize around ways that we can reduce costs in special education and again, take some of the pressure off of future budgets. I anticipate that that audit will be very successful and very productive for us. In addition to that, Dr. Hapkin, our Director of Special Services, has taken great time to work with other organizations such as Wheeler Clinic to collaborate and to bring in some services both for our special education and regular education student population to serve them in the areas of mental and emotional health issues, more and more of which we are seeing across the district. We are not alone in terms of exploding costs in special education. There are districts across the state who are facing the same challenges and the same degree of deficit that we currently have in this area. So I anticipate many conversations with my urban area school district colleagues going forward and with the Commissioner of the State Department of Education around ways, again, that we can begin to strategize and solve this issue going forward. So there is a lot of conversation to be had, a lot of work to be done, and again, I thank members of the Board of Finance today for all of your time and consideration in what was a very productive discussion this morning. With that, I'll turn it over to Gary, who will outline more specifically for you numbers that we perhaps have outlined in the scenarios, as well as some of the numbers we talked about this morning. Thank you.
Good evening, Commissioners. Thank you for the opportunity for this evening. I'd like to just comment, when I provided my first presentation to the Board of Finance approximately 2 weeks ago, I had completed a 3-year look back so that publicly we can hear what the funding of the Board of Education has had over the last 2 to 3 years. And I would concur with the remarks that in the schedules that were up on the board earlier with a couple minor corrections. But I'd just like to step back for 2 minutes, then I'll get into discussion about the proposed budget going forward. Back in 13-14, we did come to the Board of Finance with a proposed increase of 4.9%. We then did reductions of $3.8 million at that point in time, and we received a city increase of $1.2 million and excess cost funds for special education, approximately $400,000. So the total received from the city that year was $1.6 million. The $800,000 sinking fund for the technology was correct. But in the column I observed up there was a double count. It was $800,000 that was spent with the 1.6, a total of 2.34% year over year. It wasn't the $800,000 plus the wireless plus the infrastructure. It was strictly the $800,000 that was used for those two items. So, and then we provided under the Connecticut State Statute 10-248, we requested the carryover of 1% surplus of $1,026,859. And that's how we began the fiscal year for that year. In 14-15, a 2-year look back, we received an increase of $1.4 million, or 1.39%. We also received funding from the Board of Finance for our full-day kickoff of the full-day kindergarten program of $1,096,042, another 1.05%. So subtotal to our operating that year increase was 2.45%, or $2.5 million. We also received funding for capital for the full-day K program to do build-outs at the schools for equipment for the students. And also we introduced that year with the city through collaboration, $100,000 set aside for capital facility projects that are under $100,000 a year that never make the overall 10-year plan. So the total received for 14-15 was $2.8 million, or 2.75%. And again, we had the ability to preserve that carryover coming into 15-16, and it was $1,026,859 that rolled over into the subsequent year.
Madam Chair?
Yes.
Gary, if I guess interrupt you, there seems to be some dispute, if you will, with regards to saying that it was a double dipping. Can you clear that up for us, Skip, from what he was talking about? or what you mentioned versus what you talked about. We want to make sure
Yeah, and
we
again,
have our
I'm
numbers.
not challenging numbers,
No,
I'm just pointing that
but
out.
we want to make sure it's accurate.
Please.
Actually, Gary, what we want to talk about here is, yes, $800,000 is the mathematical total of the wireless and the smart boards. There's no question. That money was provided, and you spent it, and I think probably amongst all my stuff I've grabbed out of the office, I do have, that detail and so forth, and that is entirely separate from the $800,000 that we were talking about earlier, that really you used for, and we actually tracked it today, because I'm still a little new at some of how to get to some of this stuff, and Rob and I went through literally the general ledger and said, okay, well, it starts here, and let's make sure when we talk that it really was applied to health benefits, and $800,000 was applied to health benefits, and my number up there, $415,000 was in fact spent for smart boards, and I have that here, and $384,000 was spent for. There was actually a little move between those, because the smart boards were about $3,500 less, and so we took that excess and put it over to the wireless and spent it on
And I respect that, I don't want to take the time up.
No, but it's important to point out.
Thank you. Okay. Point of clarification. In coming into the proposed budget for next year, the 4.47%, we spent the month of a good part of January and a good part of February through our budget subcommittees of the Finance Committee of the Board, going through all the information as it was provided to the business office. We do a zero-based, bottoms-up approach for our budget every year. And what that means is that there's a budget planning document that goes out to all the schools, all the administrators in central office and all the administrators of the schools for planning purposes. It gives them all the guidelines and it gives them the instructions on how to use the technology and the financial system to input their budgets. When we receive that information back to the business office in its rawest form, basic, all the needs are presented from the schools in the central office. We then sit down and put a rough draft of the budget together, which is used as discussion points for our budget workshops with the Finance Committee of the Board. From there, we begin to make changes, we have discussions. But just to make a couple points here, when we look at building the baseline budget, what I call the baseline needs for the district of the year, we look at all rostered employees for the year, both certified and non-certified. And we look at the salary projections and scales that they'll be in the following subsequent years. So when we cast the salary budgets for the year, it's based on current year roster, based on the individuals that are on board at this point in time, using the salary grades for the following year. And that builds our salary budget for our certified and our non-certified staff. Our benefits this year, I'm pleased to say we had excellent benefits consultants that provided our numbers professionally, something I've wanted to see over the last couple of years, and I feel the numbers that we have this year are extremely tight. When we look at the benefits projections for the Board of Education, we also look at all the revenue streams from the employee contributions that come in from the district, as well as revenues from the state of Connecticut for subsidies for our teacher retirements, and any other revenue streams that may impact benefits. And our budget is net of those revenues, but the revenues are reported to the city and distributed into the Internal Service Fund. So what we have for a benefits budget in our operating budget is net of all the revenues that the board receives in employee contributions. It's not the gross amount. And as Robin just indicated earlier, we had some good news today. There was approximately another 4% plus or minus savings, and the impact we calculated this afternoon I provided that to the city. So when we look at salary and benefits for 16-17, just to turn the page into next year, forget all our fixed expenses to run the buildings and transport the students and all that. We're looking at a salary total of 1.65%, and we're looking at benefits and fixed charges of another 2.29%. The other benefits and fixed charges include unemployment, include life insurance, short-term disability, long-term disability, all the benefits that go to staff that work in the district. So minimally salary and benefits total to get into next year with no reduction in forces. This is the current capacity of staffing is 3.94%. The balance, or the other 0.5%, was distributed amongst other fixed operations of the district in various forms based on requests. Two critical areas from my perspective are the maintenance of plant, which is our facilities, and our transportation contract. Our transportation contract, the budget for that is built based on the contract. However, 3 years ago, to meet city reduction targets, we did a carve-out of about $300,000 out of regular transportation. Subsequent year to that, we funded parochial school transportation in town, approximately $600,000. 2 years ago, the parochial transportation was taken out of the budget. The reason being we could not hit the city reduction targets without getting into fixed cost structure of the operating budget. So we've been running, if you will, deficit spending in those accounts over the last 2 to 3 years. So what I attempted to do this year was to go back and restore some of that money on the operating side, not the full amount, but offer other options to be able to help fund transportation for next year. We also have another soft spot in expenditures to other schools. We have students from Bristol that attend other schools that we have to pay for, other magnet schools. And the amount of students that are enrolling out of district has been increasing, and our budgets have not kept pace with that. Again, to try to keep our funding down, our request for funding down, to meet the overall needs of the city in terms of the mill rate impact and in terms of requirements for reductions. So that's been running. There's a shortfall there. But the major impact on our operating budget over the last 3 to 4 years, which we talked about this morning at our meeting, has been special education. And Dr. Solik touched upon that earlier. We had an increase prior to the 4.47% for special education this year, $2.9 million. We have since level funded special education going into next year, but again have asked at our original budget proposal 2 weeks ago, are there alternative funding sources to help fund special education next year if we need it. We are in a current shortfall this year with special education. We've had dialogue on that. The city is aware of that, and we'll see how that materializes over the next couple months and where we land on that. But it brings us back to requesting those funds from the city to help get through special education. So my concern is not only meeting the salary and benefits total for next year without any reduction in forces to target the 3.94%, but that other 0.5% that's distributed to transportation, a little bit to technology, and a little bit to facilities, is just to keep pace with our current costs in those areas. We have fixed leases for our technology. We have fixed contracts under maintenance for some of our buildings that we have to outsource certain facilities work. And we haven't kept pace with that. And part of it was the establishment of the $100,000 capital fund to take care of smaller projects, but the basic operating fixed costs right now are falling behind. So minimally, we worked the budget down to the 4.47%. What was suggested as an alternative to funding, if we did get into a reduction scenario this year, can we look at some of the revenues that the city receives on behalf of the Board of Education from the state of Connecticut? Primarily, we looked at the excess cost, around $3.3 million revenues that's brought in. The way the statute is written is that if the special education budget is built on a prudent basis, on the number of students that you know are being outplaced at a given point in time when you budget your operating budget, and that budget exceeds plan over the course of the year, the Board of Education has statutory rights to that excess cost to help fund special education in that year that we're falling behind on. And that's where we are this year, and that's why that. So rather than impacting a $2.9 million increase in special education for next year on the operating side, which may push up MBR, we're looking at the alternative funding source of the revenues come in that you can credit the expenditures as we go forward and not impact MBR. We also identified Medicaid. The Medicaid laws changed. The Special Education Department files for Medicaid reimbursements for services that are provided to SPED students, and that money comes to the city. The statute's been changed that those funds should flow to the Board of Education. So for further support for special education, one of the alternative proposals to the Board of Finance 2 weeks ago is that we can't increase operating anymore. However, can we consider some of these revenue sources to help offset the operating increase and minimize impact to MBR? So I guess in summary, the 4.47 becomes critical from our perspective that to preserve staffing and to preserve the schools for next year at the 3.94%, to cover our benefits obligations, our contractual obligations for the schools and the staffing, but also the other 0.5% to to begin to try to restore some of those items that we received cuts on over the last 2 to 3 years. What we did as an alternative with the 1.44 was proposed last week. We went back, and as Ellen said earlier, we looked at different budget scenarios on how do we accomplish that. And what we did is we put together some thoughts, which again would involve reduction of force. Hypothetically, we said if we looked at closing a school and we re-engineered or reorganized the school and had students transfer to another school for attendance and being conscious of class size and all that, we looked at school A would yield about $2.1 million because we were now 3.03% away from the target of 4.47 versus the 1.44. We looked at a larger school, School B. The yield there would have been about $4.4 million. Or we looked at, if we had to do 2 schools, at $6.6 million. And then we went back and looked at everything that was taken out of the operating budget to get to the 1.4, and how can we begin to restore those things if in fact we downsized. With the downsizing initiative of schools, there's also costs. There's severance costs when people leave. There's unemployment costs that have to be figured. And then in terms of bumping with collective bargaining, in terms of reductions in forces, it's not always the higher end salaries where people are dismissed. You're dealing with people with lower seniority in a district, so you may not get the yields that you would attempt to get if you in fact went down that particular road. Also, one other point, that the 447 includes the benefits contribution of the $500,000 plus that the Controller's Office has to put in. So all the more reason we want to maintain that level of funding going forward into next year.
That was the OPEB funding?
Yes.
Yeah, it's from our actuaries.
So we followed through on that basis. So the 144 from the 4.47 is a difference of 3%. This, so in rough numbers, is $3 million. And the $3 million, again, is to cover full staffing for next year, full benefits for next year, the full pension contribution, and then a half a point distributed, trying to restore transportation and facilities and technology to the level to meet our fixed costs.
Thank you, Gary. Just a brief summary statement, and I thank you for indulging me in the opportunity. Gary mentioned costs associated with reductions in force, whether it be closing schools or eliminating programs. But there's perhaps a more significant cost if we have to go down that road, and that is the cost to our children. Because our children then are impacted with larger class sizes and fewer adult professionals. And fewer adult professionals to seek support and a quality education. None of us, not one of us in this room wants to see that happen. We care too deeply about our children and about our staff in the Bristol Public Schools. Because as we've all talked about and thought about, and we're working so hard to solve, this is a community issue, and we need to solve it as a community. It's not us versus them anymore. It's not our side versus your side. It can't be. We can't afford to approach this problem that way anymore. It's way too important for us to spend time figuring out whose issue it is. It's much more important if we can get together, as the Board of Finance and the Mayor have already extended the opportunity to us to do, to begin to solve this problem, not just for the short term, but for the long term. So I want to say in summation, the Board of Finance and the Mayor, Glenn, Skip, we have all had opportunities in past years to have great dialogue, to move forward, to begin to creatively solve this problem. On behalf of the board, I look forward to continuing that dialogue. I can only hope that we can shore up the gap between the initial recommendation, and we fully acknowledge the limited pool the city is faced with that drove that initial recommendation, and what our needs truly are for the children of this district going forward. I believe as an optimist that we can get much closer than we are right now in terms of that funding gap, and the way we're going to do it is to sit down with constructive and sometimes difficult conversations and take a look at ways that we can innovatively and creatively come up with ways to close that gap. Thank you very much.
I'm going to open it up for questions. One that I'm just going to call it right out. How is it that Northeast, that parents and is it true that Northeast had been selected and it had been communicated to the staff when this is all preliminary, or is that just part of the rumors that are circulating?
Thank you for that question, because we do want to eliminate the rumors that are circulating, Cheryl. The initial scenarios that were developed were never shared with staff. In fact, both of the schools that were initially identified as possibly under scenario circumstances being closed or could be closed were never divulged to staff deliberately. And that's because, as we've just talked about tonight, the scenarios going forward may change many, many times before we settle on a final number. And for me or for anyone to identify schools and set staff and others into motion about thinking about schools closing, specific schools closing, when we're not anywhere near making decisions around that, nor are we tonight, would be downright cruel. And so no, that information was never shared with the community or the staff.
Thank you.
Going forward.
I'm glad you're able to clarify that, because rumors do have to end. And
around just what you spoke to, that we need to long-term begin to look at perhaps regionalizing services, perhaps coming up with some other innovative ways that we can bring some of our kids back from outplay services, which are much more expensive, and meet their needs in district. So yes, we have already started that dialogue. We're looking forward to CREC's results as well and their recommendations to help us move forward with that.
Well, so it isn't just taking care of our kids, which obviously this is going to become an issue, and it is, but it's also taking other kids in from other towns. Instead of, I mean, somebody was taking our kids in. The question is, if we were going to make this thing into some sort of profit center, which we should, I mean, somebody else is doing it, why don't we? And we should be going full steam, because unless we move fast on this, this budget issue is going to bite us, and then we're going to have this problem next year if we don't move on this. One other thing, and then I'll hand it up. And what about duplication of services as well? I mean, this whole field issue, you know, rather than, and I'm probably touching on some things that are a little touching other people's areas, but it's the way it goes. If we have an entire department in the city, the Parks Department, who specializes in taking care of outdoor things like, let's say, fields, why aren't we having them do the fields throughout the city for our schools and keep the maintenance workers in where they can maintain the structure of the building itself? I mean, is that a crazy thought? Because out in the regular world, that would be unheard of, to be duplicating services like that.
Absolutely. In fact, we work closely, and our maintenance department, and Pete Fusco, works closely with members of Public Works. We, in fact, do not duplicate services at this point. We're able to maximize services because both maintenance departments work very closely together to service both the schools and the surrounding grounds, not only fields, but city resources and sidewalks and other things that we really team together to get done. So absolutely.
Mike, I think that's part of the initiative that Dr. Solak referenced with this meeting coming up, such as payroll services, such as field maintenance, items that could come together and find the least costly alternative that serves everybody and still gets the task accomplished. But thank you. Thank you. Anything else?
No.
Oh, okay. You were next. Okay.
Thank you, Dr. Solak, for the presentation. I agree. We have to work together. We need to sit down and work together to come up with a budget. However, when the Board of Finance says to the Board of Ed, go back and give us some different scenarios, I think putting out there that you're going to close 2 schools does nothing but scare teachers, students, and parents. That, to me, is not a good faith way of working on a budget. And I think that was awful the way the Board of Ed did that. And we've always worked well in the past, and I was really shocked when I saw that. How many, besides closing schools, what else did the Board of Ed look at as far as money savings? And I know we're talking about $3 million, but you chip away the budgets. We do it in our departments. We chip away the $5 here, no, $5, 1,000 here, 2,000 here, 10,000 here. What else did you look at besides closing schools?
Mayor, we didn't get into depth in terms of cost savings, and again, thanks to your invitation, I look forward to that dialogue moving forward. So I don't have information for you tonight based on that April 6th meeting, but we certainly will come forward with some concrete ideas along those lines.
So am I understanding it that you got, the board got, not you, the board got together and said, how are we going to come up with $3 million? Didn't look at any contract obligations, didn't look at perhaps going back to the unions, to reopening, didn't look at what other savings are. They just said, we're going to close schools and that's it, we're done. Am I understanding, is that pretty good summing it up?
The charge that night was simply to look at impact and thereby, as you cited, reductions without looking at possible cost savings, and that certainly isn't because we're not willing to look at that. So you are right. It was
so
a very
it was a
brief
scare tactic is
conversation.
exactly what the Board of Ed did, rather than coming up with an actual solution to the problem. Thank you.
It's perceived that some solution. Okay. Did you want to address that?
Yeah, if I could. You know, we've been a school district that's been underfunded for at least 10 years, and we have taken attempts every year. Every year we don't get what we need, and we've picked all the low-hanging fruit. Anything that we could cut, we've already cut. The only way that we can bridge a gap this big is staff, and none of us wants to make that. As the superintendent said, no one on the board wants to make that kind of decision. But there really isn't any significant cost savings that we can make at this point.
So,
John, go ahead.
I think, Chris, the issue is whether or not the board looked at what savings could be achieved if we laid off 25 teachers, what savings could be achieved if we closed the school, what savings would be achieved if we cut out A, B, and C in particular budgets. I think that's what the mayor is asking. He's not, because what the response that was just given or not given was there weren't any other scenarios considered to save that amount of money. I for one don't think that's true, because I had some conversations with folks, but
you know, we did look at it, but we felt like we were going to end up gutting programs.
well, yeah, but
And so we felt like the least harmful thing to do, and none of these choices are good choices. They're soapy choices.
Right.
But the choices were that if we consolidated a school, then we could preserve the quality of the program across the whole district. And that was really our primary intent. Is we believe that school is, as all you do, that it's the most important thing, that one of the most important things we do in our community. And we didn't want to gut the school system, so we felt like if we could consolidate some schools and save some money, and I've said before, those are only 1 or 2 year savings. They're not long-term savings closing a school. We've done it before when we closed Jennings and when we closed Bingham. But we have a structural underfunding in education. I mean, and so that's really what we're trying to attack and address.
no, and I think we all can appreciate it. We can all appreciate that, and I think the issue is that the structural, we can call it what we want, we can call it underfunding, we can call it this. The problem that the Board of Finance has, and I know everybody realizes, is that we have 30 or 40 departments that we have to consider. We try not to underfund any of them. No one ever gets exactly what they want. And the issue with education, unfortunately, is not totally local control, because we all know that the major part of the problem that every local school district in this state has is that the state does not fund education to the level that it's supposed to. We know with the state of affairs the state has, that's a long way off. But we can't, that's where Ellen's comments and Gary's comments and everybody that's Stable's comments relate to the fact that we have to build these things together. You can't build it apart. We have to find a solution. As I said this morning, somewhere up in the sky there's a solution to these problems, and it's up to us jointly to find those solutions.
Yeah, and you know, I've spoken to others, and we looked at this closing of schools. We looked at it almost in a different way of closing schools. We looked at some good things coming out. The Center of Excellence for Special Education at one of the schools, I think would be a great creative use. We're going to ask CREC to help us broker with some other communities in close proximity to us. There are some models like that. As I mentioned this morning, Soundbridge and the Farmington Diagnostic Center. So if we could build a special education center of excellence and bring some of our, we're not going to bring all of our special ed students back to our place, but if we could bring a portion back and invest that in our own community. But you know, there's a reason we have outplaced some of those students, and they may be so severe that we may not be able to bring them back in, but we certainly, it makes sense to do that. More and more school districts are starting to look at it. I mean, the RESCs were set up to handle special education, so a lot of students were outplaced to RESCs and other institutions to pay for those services. Well, now, you know, school districts are starting to look at bringing those services back in-house if they can, you know, achieve some economy of scale, and we're going to do that as well.
My question is, why did it take so long? I mean, when we go back and I read some of the minutes that have come over from Gary's report, and special ed starts to really rear its ugly head with cost overruns this year by expenses going up 27% several months ago. So why did it take this long for CREC to come in and audit, to try to nip it in the bud right from the beginning before it was $3 million in the hole?
You know, we brought this up over 2.5 years ago to have us CREC come in and do a review. Unfortunately, we couldn't get support of the board at that time. There's new leadership on the board, and we were able to get agreement from all the members to move forward with a review by CREC.
I just want to also share, and when I hear the comment that education is underfunded, if that was truly the case in some of the years, there wouldn't be surpluses that we're giving you money back that wasn't spent in a previous year. No, hear me out. One thing I've learned, and I've done many budgets, is if I ask for something, I'm going to spend it to make sure, because if you don't spend something, maybe you didn't need it. So if we have surpluses, that kind of leads me to think that there was adequate funding in those years.
I'd love to respond to that question. Thank you. In 2009 and 2010, the federal government created a program called the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act after the 2008 crash. And so we received federal money in those 2 years. And we did not have to spend all that money, and we didn't. In fact, we ended up returning some of that. In fact, some of the sinking funds that you saw tonight, the genesis of that money was from that surplus that we returned to the city and the Board of Finance. We didn't do what some governmental agencies do, Cheryl, and spend all the money that we received. Maybe in retrospect we should have, but we didn't, because we thought that was the prudent thing to do at that time, was to return the money back to the city.
Which we appreciate.
And, you know, so we didn't do that. And, you know, and you mentioned the comment that we're not underfunded. We had a symposium, which we invited you all to, which a speaker came and showed us how much we were underfunded. In fact, if I recall the number, the state, if they were fully funding their own ECS formula, would be paying us $14.2 million more. Our federal special education is a federal law. When that law was passed in the late 60s, early 70s, the idea was the federal government was going to support special education to the tune of 30%. Well, that's not happened either. And, you know, so we're kind of, you know, compelled to come to the city and say, can you make up some of those shortfalls? We wish we weren't here, to be honest with you. We wish we had full funding in education. But we're not. And so that's why we're here, to try to craft a solution that works for the community and works for the Board of Finance and works for the education community.
Just to, and correct me if I'm wrong, I just want to, and I Googled a couple of the people in their foundation, and they seem to have come from private institutions, their background that did charter schools. So do you think that that's part of a push to get more charter schools or more magnet schools and privately funded schools by this group?
No, they are funded by a hedge fund, but they are not a charter, espousing charter schools.
I Google everything, I'm sorry.
That's fair, and I'm glad you brought up the question. The reason I brought the symposium to Bristol was so that more people in the community could understand school finance and how difficult it was.
Okay.
It is.
Chris, has there been any thought in the past or talk in the past about closing Northeast School? Has that ever come up in the past?
Not that I've heard.
I only ask that because for the last 3 years I've been asked, there's rumors from parents, are you talking about closing Northeast? And I always say, it's news to me, so I didn't know if that was ever on the table at your...
The only schools that we talked about in meetings that I've been in were Bingham and Jennings, and other than the ones that we closed to build the two K-8 schools. But, you know, we never had any contemplation until we got into this budget year and we had such a funding gap, this wouldn't even have been considered. But we were in such a gap, because even... I want to emphasize, I hope I'm not emphasizing too much, but the 4.47 doesn't even provide us any additional funding for special education. Cheryl mentioned why is special ed jumping up so much. Well, we've zero funded it the last 2 years. If we had just given it a reasonable increase in those 2 years, we wouldn't be in a 27% explosion.
I'm not sure I'd agree with that, because, you know, your spending is in the prior year what your spending was. And just in this year, taking the numbers from Gary's presentation and the cost per student, that's how I derived that. So
yeah, but I mean, if we had reasonable increases this year, it would still be up. There's no question it's up. I think I saw the stat that our average outplaced case went from $57,000 per student to $77,000 per student. We couldn't account for that. We do have some DCF placements in town that we can't account for. And we have people that move into the town with very serious special needs students. It's very hard for us to budget. We build our budget almost 18 months ahead of time. So when we actually build the budget, it's old. So we don't know what students are in. We build it based on the students we have at the time.
Orlando.
Thank you. This might be for Chris and Glenn to answer. Glenn, on slides 8 and 9, we talked about capital projects, and we said, I think, Robin, the city pays for it, and then we have some state grants that are involved.
That's true.
So if we continue with the premise that 2 schools at maximum may be closed, and those schools received capital funding through state grants, would we have to repay any or all of that state grant portion, and so therefore add it to our debt?
Yeah, that came up in the meeting today. Chris did address it, and the answer is yes. I'm not sure that we know the number, do we, Chris?
Well, first of all, we're not planning on closing the schools entirely. If we close the schools entirely, there is a carve back. But the plan is really to repurpose those schools to something else that the Board of Education is going to use. So there would be no carve back. I will say that in the K-8s, for instance, there's a carve back there. I saw in another school district where their enrollment was 50% what they projected when they built the school, and there was a carve back. But that's why you see us maximize the number of students in our K-8, so there is no carve back.
Hold on. Orlando, where you set?
Just one other thing. So just an idea, if you're talking about a special ed center, I know there had been some discussion years ago about charter schools or magnet schools here as generating revenue. Is that something else that we can look at? That's long term, though, I understand.
You know, I think we could certainly look at a magnet school. A themed magnet school probably wouldn't be a bad idea for this community. Some have talked about having a theater arts themed magnet school. It's only sort of been talked about conceptually. We did, when the state was building lots of magnet schools, we did have some conversation with them, but they wouldn't give us the flexibility we needed for our own students. It's a lottery system, and we couldn't guarantee spots for our own students, so we kind of walked away from that. What the state is pushing now more is inter-district magnets, where Plainville and Bristol and Plymouth would get together and build a magnet, and that's what they're looking at more than kind of the chef magnets. What we see now more is this collaboration or consortiums that would build a magnet school between communities.
What can we do, though, today? Well, these parents are here because of class size. I read the last few minutes of the Board of Ed meetings, and some parents were there on behalf of West Bristol, I believe, saying class sizes. Just could you remind me what the class size mandates are in the state, and how this will impact our class sizes if we close those.
It's my understanding there's no state mandates. Some union contracts have it built into their clause. I don't believe we do. We are certainly concerned about our class sizes. We don't want to see them increment up any more than they already are. We have guidelines, but they're not rigid guidelines, just our own internal guidelines. But
Go ahead.
you know, we did have some testimony from someone last month, which I think is the first one we've had in some time, but we had some people last year where there's a couple of classes that are anomalies that have bumped up more than sort of our mean, but we look at that every year. You know, sometimes we have a lot of mobility in different schools, and so some classes do increment up, but our Human Resource Director always looks at that. We look at it in August when we start seeing what our enrollment projections are going to be, and we try to balance this the best we can and try to make sure there's equity all across the district. Did I hear someone? Sam, you want to whisper our numbers?
22 right now.
So the answer was 22 for K to 5. K2 is 22. And up to what? That's our mean. And okay, maximum is 28 and 3.5, but 22 in K2.
And are we exceeding that? And just another.
There are a couple sections that are at or exceeding that. I think they're at it. I don't know if they're exceeding it.
So this closure will do what? What will that do to these classes?
The projection is probably about 3 students a class.
Do the teachers with, I know I hear every night, Brenda's got 24 kids and she's pulling her hair out. Do the teachers with 28 students, do they have an 8 in the class or anything?
Again, there are some schools districts that do provide some paraprofessionals. We're not one of them that has that capacity. We've never had any kind of excess capacity in our budget to build paraprofessionals in our classrooms. But we certainly, as a board, we'd love to have that, but we just don't have those kind of resources.
But you do have them in classes where there are a significant number of mainstream students, correct?
No.
What are they saying over there? No.
The reality.
I think, I'm going to be frank. When we left on the 4th, okay, if you recall, when we closed that meeting and said, you know, I know this might not work where we are. Let's find middle ground. But I think my parting words, if I recall, and my memory's going, is every year, there's the pitchfork and whatever thing that we're going to cut band, we're going to cut middle school sports. We had the lacrosse players across the back one year, and I said, please don't do this to us, okay? So worst case, I'm thinking, okay, we're going to find some middle ground here, folks. There's going to be give and take on both sides. I'm not going to look through, and I'm not going to say things, but I'm not going to see certain raises at 5% in the budget book. Or I'm not going to see certain other increases. There's going to be middle ground. I think our board is willing to give, but we need something here. Never in my wildest dreams did I think I'd hear schools were going to close, and that just can't happen, guys. So you've got to give, and I think we can do it. I don't know. I'm just going to do a show of hands. I lost my notes. See, I told you I'm short. Where is that? I'm just curious. Here we go. How many people are here are in favor? I'm going to ask this, and the last question, by the way, is a trick question. I'm just warning you. How many of you are in favor of keeping the schools open? Okay. How many of you are in favor of full funding? How many of you feel there's middle ground? And how many of you want your taxes to go up? In this room, and what you have to realize is I appreciate that you guys are all invested parents and you're invested teachers, and I'm so happy you're there because I don't think I could teach a class. I do a youth group, that's enough. But I'm going to tell you, the thing that we struggle with is we have seniors on a budget. You've heard that before. We have families that are scraping by, and if the taxes go up, their landlord just raises the rent, and then they're struggling. And these are the kids you're servicing, and so then more servicers are needed to them. There's got to be middle ground, but we have to balance everything, and that's the point we're trying to make. So I'm just going to open up for more questions before I start getting off on my soapbox. So, any other questions? John, you have your hand up.
No, I just had a comment. You and others often talk about level funding and underfunded. We understand that. The problem is we can't make up the difference between the state and what the feds do. There's no way any municipality can do that. To say to us, and you know where I stand when it comes to education funding, but to say to us that you've been level funded is really, it's like a sharp stick in our eye, because we've worked hard at funding, not just education, but public works and a library and whatever. We can't say to all the other departments, you're not going to get anything because we've got to give it all over here this year. We can't do that. And I think you understand it. So again, our challenge is to find a way to give you the amount of money that you need to operate contractually, special ed-wise, with a little bit to go around. And I have a major issue with facilities, because if you don't take care of them, it's going to cost us that plus in the future, and the city's found that out on a couple of instances. And frankly, I'm not averse to raising taxes. You know, $1.5 million tax rate to me, to my property, is $13.27 a month. That's not a lot of money, as far as I'm concerned. It's $100 and some odd a year. We need to take a look at that, because in order for us to support all of the things that we get in this city, all of the things we get, from education to trash removal, to all the things that we get that some other communities pay extra for individually, you know, we have to be willing to pay for that, or we need to say, we're not going to do that anymore, and you go out and hire your own person to come and pick up your trash or whatever. Those are the challenges we have, and it's worked. Granted, not always to everybody's satisfaction over the years, but for the most part, we've always been able to achieve a level ground here. And that means open discussion all the time, every day, about every one of these issues.
May I respond?
Yes, you may.
Absolutely. You know, after we left our meeting on April 4th, it was clear to me we had a significant funding gap. You know, if I just sort of tick them off on my hand and I sort of round up, but we had year over year we're $3 million off on special education. 2.2 was in salaries, 500,000 pension, and prior to tonight it was 1.6 health insurance. That's all the numbers that I looked at. And I said, you said you would provide us 1.4%. And it looked like that we had no choice but to look at bold ideas to make changes to manage with the resources that we were going to be provided. And so that's why we looked at the options that we looked at, because it was clear to us that the city didn't have the capacity to give us what we needed to close that funding gap. And so we're going to look at every possible way to manage, and it's the superintendent's responsibility as an agent of the state to manage with the resources she can get. She doesn't have the option to overfund her budget. We're not like the state. You know, she has to balance her budget every year. Or the superintendent, it could be male, I suppose. But, you know, so that is our challenge, and that's why we came up with a bold plan.
Yeah, I'm not criticizing it. I'm just...
I was.
You know, sorry. And to be honest with you, I don't think anybody on our Board of Education was looking to do that. Not one of the commissioners, and I know none of the staff, wanted to do that. That was not a proposal that they wanted to put forward. But how do we balance with such a huge gap? You know, special education, we all forget, we don't really have a choice not to fund that. The federal government says we must fund it, and there's not enough excess on the regular ed side to make up that shortfall.
Did the Board of Ed take a vote to close the school? Did you take a vote to close?
We did not. As I've told everybody, these are conceptual plans. We were asked to give an impact statement if funding stayed at 1.4. And so we looked at and had the superintendent and her team craft some ideas that we could bridge such a significant gap that I just delineated.
Did that idea have full support of the full Board of Ed?
We didn't take a vote, but I heard no one objecting to the plans.
All right, John.
Chris,
Wait a minute now. Go ahead, John. John, Paul, he's coming up. Go
You have
ahead.
to yield to me, Mr. O'Brien. I'm not throwing the ball at you. We have the same issue as far as I'm concerned. The lack of communication is on both sides. To me, I think that's why we are in the situation we're in, because we didn't have the amount of communication that was necessary in order to find an accommodation to the issues we had.
And I will say, we did reach out.
Enough said.
I thought Chris needed a short break. I think wasting time talking about the past is not going to do any of us any good. We are where we are. We've been successful. We've had the best Urban school district in the state for many years, but we have a serious problem for next year. And just as Glenn made a recommendation to the Board of Finance, which wasn't acted on, Ellen made a recommendation to the Board of Education, which wasn't acted on. But based on the preliminary budget, with an increase of 1.4, we talk in percentages. Percentages aren't really important. Dollars are important.
Right.
It was $3 million less than we need to fund the existing staff. An average employee on the Board of Ed is $100,000 if you take the principals, the maintenance workers, and a normal teacher, including benefits. That's 30 people.
Can you repeat that?
$100,000.
Okay.
Teacher with benefits is $100,000 on average. Some are higher.
I think some are disagreeing with that.
Well,
That's why you're not getting assistance.
but it's easy to document, as you know. And if you bring in a principal, it's higher. If you bring in a custodian, it's lower. But anyway, it's 30 people. So the alternatives are you keep the schools open as they are, and you reduce 30 people. So if that's one section in each school, that means an average, as you heard, is 22 to 28 people. Those students are dispersed out over the other three sections, because most schools have 4 sections of each grade. So you increase class size by that amount, or what was recommended by the superintendent was if you close a school, you can consolidate the staff in a different way. Or the third choice, which was reviewed, I don't want to give the impression that it was a scare tactic, because it certainly wasn't. I think it was a recommendation as the only solution to resolve a $3 million shortfall. The fourth is you eliminate programs. For example, there's 22 art teachers in the entire system. So if we don't do art, we can eliminate 22 positions. That's still a shortfall towards the $3 million. So I don't want to give the impression that this was a scare tactic. The reality of the situation is there's a $3 million difference between what was recommended by the controller and what we need to keep existing staff. We've special that out of the equation for now. But just under our contractual obligations, we negotiated in good faith with the teachers. We were awarded the contract through mediation, which means we went as far as we could go. State law is quite clear with respect to teachers and everyone else. And we're just been told again by the state that we have to negotiate immediately with 2267 because we had a four-year gap.
Who's that?
Custodians, paraprofessionals, and the famous cafeteria workers. But the point is, you know, they have been without a contract for 4.5 years. While the custodian, we debated whether or not to privatize schools. We seem to have been successful in reducing that deficit, but I just want to be clear to everyone. The difference between funding our existing staff and what was proposed in the initial budget is $3 million.
Through the chair.
Yes.
So, and I don't know if you want to answer this to Chris, but just playing devil's advocate. Chris had said, the chairman had said that closing the schools was going to do good things. We're going to bring back programs and everything else. So,
Well, let's be realistic. That's theoretical. To talk about a regionalization of some special education programs, it would never happen in 2 or 3 years. I mean, it would take years. It's not going to happen next year, and it's definitely not going to happen by September. You need the coordination of other school districts.
he painted a rosy picture. I don't know. I'm asking the question.
Well, I'm being honest. Let me tell you, there's no chance that you could bring in the type of program next year that was described. That's a long-term vision and perhaps somewhat optimistic. That's my opinion.
I'll disagree with you on one thing, that I believe this is all a scare tactic. You got what you wanted, you have the audience to preach to, but I believe that was nothing but a scare tactic what you did. That's not a way to sit down and good faith negotiate over money. You originally came in looking for $9.2 million, not 4.7.
That's correct. It was not a scare tactic. It's your opinion. I respect that because I respect you. But
Okay. I have a question over here. Was that Ron?
I just have a comment.
Yes.
What is our timetable? We have until when to finalize this budget. We need to come up with solutions. We can sit here, we can debate all night. What is our timetable?
Well, originally, and I'm just going to say what's out there, and that this can all move, okay? Originally, the concept was to accept the budget through joint board on May 16th, which to do that meant that we would want to try to come to resolution and vote on the budget next week at our Board of Finance meeting. Those are not cast in stone. I think the drop dead date is really what it takes to print the new tax bills, ultimately. The state, their final session, I believe, is May 4th. So hopefully at that point, we'll know any final effects, that anything could happen. I always worry about implementer bills that get passed at the last minute that have dire effects. It's not just, as I shared this morning, it's just not the education system that gets unfunded mandates, but it's public works and parks, and everybody does. So we all live under the risk of what gets passed at the last minute. So if May 4th we know everything and we continue this dialogue and we say, hey, let's find that middle ground. Maybe well, I'm not going to say anything. I'll get hit by somebody, I'm sure, if I throw out a number. So I'm going to play it safe. But come up then with a plan. And I'm just going to be bold and say maybe every teacher that retires this year, at the end of this year, you replace with a level 1 or 2. I know that's more work for you guys to bring on a new teacher, but guess what? I work in a nonprofit and we can't pay the staff a lot, so guess what? I'm always training brand new green accountants that just come out of school and are younger than my kids now. So I get it. I get it's harder. But those are kind of the things we meet. We look for things. But if these are things that can be tangible, and I know you're going to get up and say, yeah, we try to do that, but make a promise that they're all level 1 or level 2 or something.
Madam Chairwoman, I just want to tell you that we have been doing that for the past several years. We've been very cognizant of the rewards that we get in that respect, and we've been hiring, I'm not going to say young, because that's a politically incorrect word, but we have been hiring new, innovative teachers, and they are coming in on step 1, step 2.
Good to hear. Thank you. But those are some of the things. So to answer your question, Ron, we've got time, but I don't want to say we'll meet in a month. We need to set a timetable. We need to commit to that, and not to say, give me your impact statement. I want you to find some cuts. I want you to find some tangible cuts. Okay? And I don't want to hear the art teachers, because one of the art teachers out there used to babysit my kids, and she'll shoot me if I walk out the door. So, seriously, look at, and I'm not going to look at Mr. Winninger either, maybe a principal, an extra principal at a school or something. Where can you sacrifice without getting rid of a program? Come up with those tangible things. Look at all these people. We got 147 people in this room that have ideas. Okay? If you guys have an idea, tell them. Okay? The best ideas come out of people who are in the field. Okay? So, when should we regroup? We do have a Board of Finance meeting. I know that's only Tuesday, okay? But we're going to be talking about this on Tuesday, where we feel with the budget. You know, it might be too quickly for you to come back. Can you come back with some thoughts at that point? Okay. We will schedule another workshop as well.
Yeah, we would look forward to the opportunity to do that, Madam Chairman, so we would be happy to be here Tuesday.
Okay.
With some creative ideas along the lines of what you're requesting.
Okay, and then what we can do is look at the calendar and set another special meeting for the full budget adoption.
Sure.
With still knowing that we might not get everywhere by next Tuesday, but I want to be closer, okay? And notice both hands. We're coming, we're coming. I'm looking for that middle ground. Do you guys want to find middle ground? Am I here? You guys want to find middle ground?
Maybe I'd like to clarify something, Madam Chairman. Just so I know, this is the budget that it was proposed for 4.7% increase. And over here, it doesn't say any increase for special education. It's zero from last year to this budget.
That's correct, Mr. Carrier. We did not include special education as an increase under that 4.47%. That does not include an increase in special ed.
Okay, and in that same summary of this book, it also said that salary and benefit is increased by 3.94% out of the 4.47. That's quite a bit instead of closing school. Maybe we should consider taking a flat year, because I'm here in this budget period for 3 years now.
Again?
And every year I've seen those increase. I know the average are not.
Well, these are things they'll come back with. So on Tuesday, and there will be public session, but I hope you don't all come to talk, because I don't want to go home at midnight. Okay. But public session will be here on Tuesday. We'll look forward to your ideas. We will, I'm not sure, at this point, I don't see us voting on a budget next week, which gives us some time. So I want to just look at the board. Any final questions, comments, concerns? So in closing, I have so many people to thank. I want to thank the Board of Ed for being open and working with us, both staff and the board members. It's not easy. I want to thank the Board of Finance, our city councilors who are here, and our controller's office. But I also want to thank you parents, teachers that have come out, because you know, you're the taxpayers. We're here to serve you. And so we need to find a way to make it work. If you have ideas, let me know. Let them know. That's what it's going to be. It's going to be a joint effort that we all come together. So I'm going to ask for an adjournment.
So move it.
Okay.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Thank you.